I thank you all for the privilege of this very, very special occasion. Enormous privilege to be invited to this podium. Yes, it was an inside job. And it's not because, it's not an ex officio thing, it's not because of his role as once chairman, now vice chairman of our board. It's because Tom Spurgeon is one of the finest human beings I've ever known, and I would have a hard time saying no to him for anything. He drives a hard bargain, though, on your behalf. You should know this. When he called me up about it, he said, "Now, I'd like to have you there, but the committee's pretty tough-minded. And this is a very solemn occasion, you know, George Washington's birthday and all that." And he said, they've asked me to administer a little test, measure your fitness for this assignment. He said, they want to know, can I tell them that you are a faithful believer in the Constitution of the United States? I said, well, yeah, Tom. He said, then may I assume that you are a staunch defender of the Constitution, of the First Amendment? I said, well, yes. He said, then you're a believer in free speech. I said, of course. He said, good, because that's what you're giving. But of course, I'm glad to do that, and the honor alone will make it, I hope, it'll make it worth my while. You'll have to decide. At least now you know to whom to give either the credit or the blame when the night's through. After I did a little homework, I confessed to some mixed feelings about this, though. Looking back over the list of predecessors, I really don't know what anyone could hope to say that would be additive or incremental to the wisdom that must have been delivered from this podium by heroes of mine, former presidents, vice presidents, George Will, Charles Krauthammer, and others. But Alan Simpson used to say that mixed feelings are what a father experiences when his daughter comes home from a date with a Gideon Bible under her arm. I'm sorry. Everybody had enough time for that one now. Congratulations on 121 years. At its inception, I guess this is the central message I'd like to leave tonight. At its inception, this was probably not that remarkable an event. Probably a lot of things like it around the country, probably fewer today. Thank goodness you're doing it. I want to leave you with the thought that this nation needs to replicate this event, or at least the spirit that animates it, in ways very relevant to our issues that face us today as a country. I don't need to tell you about the endemic problem of civic illiteracy in our country. It's been amply documented over and over how little Americans, not just young Americans, know. Just one factoid relevant to the evening. In one recent survey, fewer than 50% of Americans could name the general who commanded the American forces at Yorktown. In one recent scan that was nationwide, they reported the results state by state. And I have some good news. I finally found something that Illinois can beat Indiana in. 43% wasn't a very proud outcome. Only 36% of Hoosiers passed that pretty simple exam. 43% of people here in Illinois did. Ignorance of our history has been compounded more and more in recent years by a phenomenon people have taken to calling presentism. Presentism is the fallacy through which people superimpose the values, the norms of today on the past, and then pass usually sanctimonious, smug judgment on our predecessors who weren't as knowledgeable about the world, the universe, as we, how could they be, or as morally advanced as people today imagine that we are. And so you've seen this playing itself out in various fashions. I've been teaching a course on World War I to students. I find that even the brightest students, and this is an honors course at our university, who come to our school, it's not their fault, but they don't know much history at all. They don't know anything about that era and how it changed the last century. So I thought that'd be a useful course to teach, but we was talking in the very first session about this problem of presentism. I break them up, and they sit at tables throughout the semester, and country by country. There's a flag on every table. So the Brits, the French, the Russians, the Germans, the Turks, Austro-Hungarians. And hindsight is forbidden. They have to speak for their country, and is in the given the understandings people had in that day. And the ability to put ourselves in the position of others, as Adam Smith said, was in Theory of Moral Sentiment said, was really in many ways the definitive human quality. And a lot of people today seem to have lost it, and it leads them to make, I think, sadly, harsh judgments and fallacious judgments on those who went before us. John, I didn't know, or at least remember, that you were an alum of George Washington University. But possibly the saddest factoid I can tell you about this historical ignorance problem today is that 70% of undergraduates at George Washington University recently said they would favor changing the name of the school because he didn't measure up to certain standards, presumably as someone who inherited slaves. As you may know, never sold one, freed them all at Martha's death, which was the first moment at which that could happen under the laws of the time, and endowed them and their children for the remainder of their lives, an astonishingly forward-thinking view for his time. But even our greatest American has not been spared the judgments of so-called presentists. The denigration of giants by yesterday's giants by today's midgets, I think, is one of the saddest features of our time. So the father of our country. It was Claire Booth Luce once said that every president gets one sentence in history. Now, certain presidents, and I think George Washington was one, are 2 and 3 sentence presidents, but if you had to start with one, it would be father of our country. So I thought a lot about that term prior to coming here. What did it mean then? What might it or ought it mean now? And I guess those are the thoughts I want to leave with you tonight. It had various meanings, very literal, of course, at the time of the Revolution. Without Washington, there is no country. We lose the war. Now, it wasn't because, scholars in the audience will know, it wasn't really because he was a great general. He made a lot of mistakes, some of which were very costly and some of which could have cost us the war. But Napoleon always said the same thing about generals. When told about a general who was a brilliant tactician, great leader of men, personally very courageous, Napoleon once said, yes, 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 but is he lucky? General Washington was pretty lucky on a number of occasions. He would have said it wasn't luck, it was providence. And many of us would draw the same conclusion. But in any event, he may have been a great strategist. He stretched that war until eventually the British couldn't sustain it and found themselves in a no-win situation Yorktown. But he's not the father of our country because of his military brilliance. But what he did that won the war, as Douglas Sallow Freeman said, he was a moral rallying point at the darkest moments. His personal courage, his personal commitment to the cause, his sacrifice, his visible sacrifice for the cause, held together what were in certain cases dwindling numbers of weakened volunteers, long enough to give birth to the country that we know. He was certainly the father of our country at almost as critical a moment when the Articles of Confederation were failing. The centrifugal forces of, after all, what had been fiercely independent, 13 independent entities, gotten together for the convenience, gotten together first of all to win their liberty, but really for convenience, and in a system which was deeply flawed, could never have been the basis of a successful, long-term great nation. George Washington wanted nothing more but to enjoy his later years, as the song reminded us, under his own trees. If he doesn't go to the Constitutional Convention, it may never have happened at all. It would almost certainly have failed. It was only Washington being there, if you read about this, that gave that meeting credibility and gave it continuity at dozens of moments when it threatened to fly apart. But what that single person represented to folks who differed violently sometimes on other questions has cemented together a meeting which gave us a workable federal system and the country that we know. And then he was the father of our country, and here the song was perfectly apposite in a very fundamental way. As one of his biographers said, his greatest service was his last, when he could have been leader for life. He stepped away. As you'll know, he led the rest of his life an organization called the Order of the Cincinnati, after the legendary Roman who left his farm and homestead, went and saved the Roman Republic, and then went back to his plow. And that was the ethic of George Washington, who time and again sought less power than he was offered. After Trenton, the Congress, the Continental Congress, offered him much wider authority over civilian as well as military affairs, and he said no. He said, when we took up the sword, we did not give up the citizen. He was teaching in the way that a parent, a father should. He was teaching an infant country what freedom is about and what self-governance is about. And so, yes, he was the father of this country in multiple indispensable ways. But what might he mean today? And here I would like to suggest that we need some fatherhood of the kind that Washington provided, in ways that weren't as necessary then, but might be pivotal and life-saving now. You know, you'll think about this from time to time. We are such a young country. This organization has been here for more than half the life of the country. We are halfway back to the Revolution, when you were started 120 years ago. The Revolution was as close as we are tonight to that founding of the Creve Coeur organization. Next year, by my reckoning, we'll be halfway to Valley Forge, when your founding will be halfway back to Valley Forge. when the whole thing came so close to unraveling, probably forever. And at the time, we even in that short historical blink of less than 250 years, which to a European is yesterday, we've come to think that freedom and liberty and democracy is the natural order of events. Well, it isn't. It's still a relatively fledgling experiment. And history has belonged to the tyrants and the dictators and the authoritarians. And political history is full of skeptics who, yes, were aware of this idea of government by consent of the governed, cute little notion, can't work over time. It runs against human nature, which is something for give me something for nothing. Let's work. We'll fund ourselves today. Someone else can worry about tomorrow. The natural temptation of the politician to promise things that he cannot deliver, and always, in times of turmoil and trouble, the proclivity of people and peoples to turn to the man on the white horse, the authoritarian, the dictator who's going to make it all better. The founding generation was deeply mindful of this. They talked openly about how long it could last. Adams thought 75 years maybe, 2 generations maybe. When Lincoln talked about the mystic cords of memory stretching back to patriots' graves, he was worrying about whether people were already forgetting what it took to give birth to a country, to give birth to this new system of freedom and free peoples. And so I discovered in writing one book that, to me, fascinating, on some of the initial coinage of the Republic was the Latin phrase, exito in dubio est, means the outcome is still in doubt, success is still in doubt. They were deeply worried that we would lose the sense of how precious our freedom is, how dearly it was bought, how unnatural a thing it is, and the character traits that stubbornly insist on liberty and freedom from having one's life ordered by someone else. And in that sense, we could use Washington right now. Maybe not as a general, maybe not even as a political figure. Fatherhood needs to come back in general in this country. I've said for decades now, if I ever trip over that apocryphal lamp on the beach, you can keep wishes 2 and 3. Wish number 1 for me would be that every child in this country grow up in an intact household with a loving mother and father. As you must know, if you changing just that one thing would make so many of the others pathologies and social problems, that heartbreaking dilemmas that we've run into all shrink back dramatically. George Washington set an example of selflessness, even self-sacrifice. And I'm not really talking about his physical courage, which was legendary. From the Indian Wars forward, he put himself in harm's way and had horses shot out from under him and had his clothes tattered by bullets, and providentially for us all was spared to do all the great things that he did. But when he thought of sacrifice, he was thinking about something that was more precious to him than life itself, which was honor and reputation he said to Richard Henry Lee, when he accepted the role of General of the Continental Armies, "It will be the ruin of my reputation." And to him, that was the greatest risk of all, greater than the loss of life. And you know, that sense that there are things more precious, even than life, it gave birth to a phrase you'll all recognize: our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. You know, we could use more people today who think about honor at all, let alone think about it as sacred and something on a par with life and fortune. But Washington did. He thought selflessly, even in the greatest moments of his life and triumph. Go read his dispatch to the Congress on the surrender at Yorktown. It says, I'll paraphrase, in one sentence, it says, "It is my honor to report to the Congress that the armies of General Cornwallis have been reduced and, in effect, surrendered." The entire rest of the dispatch is praise of other people. You know, at a time when, as throughout history, despotism is lurking everywhere, and people have, too many people, in their historical ignorance and perhaps in their lack of empathy for how difficult it was to do what the founding generation and their successors did, are tempted to give away their liberty to some authority that they think will take care of them better than they can take care of themselves, will enforce either values or policies that they have decided are better for everyone else. Once again, we could use a Washington to remind us that our rights flow from God and that they are individual and that they are worth defending always as more important even than life itself. One of his, I think, best biographers, Richard Brookhiser, wrote, I think, a summary line that I would submit to you, captures the ways in which I believe this nation needs his example or some modern equivalent. Brookhiser wrote that Washington taught us through the way he lived, not his letters, not his statements, not even his service. The first form of self-government is governing ourselves. Washington, when asked to sum up his approach to life, said, "I always walk a straight line." He lived by a code that we would recognize today as traditional morality, I suppose you'd call it. But his ironclad fidelity to his way, to that code, and to upholding it always with honor and reputation being his premier goals, is so far from the examples that are too often now put before us as citizens or put before our young people, the young people who will determine how free or not this country is 10 and 20 and 50 years from now. Purdue University got a very nice break 4 or 5 years ago when the owners of the only replica of the great painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, which hangs, you'll have seen it if you visited the Metropolitan Museum in New York. It's 20-some feet wide. It's a spectacular canvas, and we have that, the only authorized replica. And Happily, it was put on long-term loan to us by its owners, who judged correctly that we would revere it and give it a place of honor. And happily, it came along just as we were building. We think of it as the 21st century library. It's a spectacular place that's full of students studying all the time. It's a home for the so-called active learning, where instead of passively sitting in lecture halls, students are engaged in projects and problem solving and much more interactive modes. And in the big reading room on the second floor there, we've hung that painting. It's my hope that generations of young people coming through Purdue will look at it in awe. I don't know how you could have any other reaction to a work of art like this, and be struck with curiosity, if they haven't been taught about the father of our country, will be motivated to learn a little more, absorb a little bit of the qualities that I've been trying to mention tonight. We hope that by this fall we will have in place at our school a requirement of some kind. I've suggested to the faculty that we'll certify that every Purdue graduate knows something of American history and civics and has passed a test that validates that. And if we do that, I promise you there'll be some questions about George Washington on that exam. At the end of that book, many of you will have read it, but let me just remind you, Brookhiser poses a number of questions that he thought summed up this greatest of American lives and greatest of contributions to the America that we know and love. He writes, "Do we derive our notions of respect and our definitions of honor from our ideas of right and wrong? Do we love others enough that if we had an unwarranted power over their lives, we would struggle to give it up? Do we understand that liberty is not a vacation from restraint, but a duty to govern, starting with ourselves?" And Brookhiser finishes that the model of George Washington's life gives us these lessons. This, he says, is Washington's patrimony. I think the question facing us as Americans now, the big questions in front of us are not matters of national security, trade, whether to universalize health insurance. These are all subordinate. The big question is, what kind of people will we be? Will we be the kind of people who the founding generation fretted and worried would no longer dominate in this country? That the virtues, the unique virtues that they, as Joseph Ellis said, the greatest generation of political talent ever seen in this country or maybe anywhere at one point in time, that they embodied, but that George Washington personified above and beyond any and all of them, first among that astonishing crowd. Will we be that kind of people? If we are, these other problems that concern us, we'll resolve them all. We'll surmount them all, and we'll remain the great country, not only for our own sake, but as a beacon to those elsewhere who would love to live in such conditions of freedom and prosperity. Now, as much as in the snows of Valley Forge, we need a moral rallying point. And there's no Washington walking among us now, and if we wait for one, we may wait forever, but we have his life to study, and we have his example to emulate. The real question is not what is his patrimony as the father of our country. To me, the real question is, will we prove worthy children in the Washington tradition? To which I conclude, exito in dubio est. Thank you for this occasion. I only wish that every community everywhere in the country would show the wisdom to promptly imitate it and hold their own each and every year. Thank you for sharing it with me.
I'm back here. They gave it to me all wrapped up, but President Daniels, how about those outstanding remarks on George Washington? On behalf of the Board of Governors, I know you already have a replica of the great painting by Emanuel Leutz at Purdue, but now you have a replica of the great sculpture, lifetime sculpture by Houdon of George Washington, inscribed, Mitch Daniels, 121st George Washington Banquet, Creve Coeur Club of Peoria, February 25, 2019. Thank you very much. Thank you. Here we go. Thank you.
Couldn't be better.
Thank you. Outstanding.